This story centers on a family thrown into chaos when the husband discovers his wife's infidelity during what is supposed to be a warm, bonding weekend at their lake house. The revelation unfolds in front of their teenage daughter and the wife's father, forcing all of them to confront long-ignored cracks in their relationships. Family's a fragile thing, more delicate than it looks. For years, I thought ours was solid, built on love, trust, and routine. But routine can rot just as easily as it can hold things together. My wife had distant, not cold exactly, but far away in her mind. I chalked it up to the grind of life, ignored the signs. Our daughter, sharp as a tack, seemed to notice more than I did. She'd been quieter lately too. Maybe it was just a teenage mood swings, or maybe she saw what I didn't. We went to the lake house, a place full of old memories and unspoken promises. My wife insisted we needed it, a weekend to reconnect. I agreed, thinking it'd clear the air. But that house, with its silence and two close walls, doesn't let anything hide for long. It started small, a look, a moment of hesitation, and spiraled from there. By the time the weekend was over, nothing about us would be the same. Disasters don't wait for invitations and leave you staring at the mess, wondering how it all began. This is where it started, the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. The lake house, once a place of peace, was heavy with something unspoken. My wife seemed restless, her eyes darting to her phone too often. Our daughter, perceptive as ever, watched her like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I tried to focus on the weekend, board games, grilled meals, small talk about school and work, but the conversations felt forced, like someone was walking a tightrope, avoiding whatever it was we weren't saying. Then there was a late-night phone call. My wife stepped out onto the porch, her voice low, the shadows hiding her expression. I told myself it was work. She said as much, but something didn't sit right. It was subtle, like a string pulled too tight, waiting to snap. The signs were there if I had been willing to see them, but denial has a funny way of keeping you blind till it's too late. The next morning, the tension lingered like a fog. No one could shake. My wife was unusually quiet, her smile thin and brittle. Our daughter picked up on it immediately. She watched her mother with narrow eyes, her teenage intuition piecing together what I couldn't or wouldn't see. Breakfast was a strained affair. The laughter felt rehearsed, conversation shallow. My wife excused herself to check on something upstairs, leaving her phone on the counter. I caught my daughter's glance as she eyed it. A quick flicker of something, suspicion maybe, but she said nothing. Neither did I. It wasn't until much later, when the house had gone quiet and the stars were hanging heavy over the lake, that I noticed her phone still sitting on the kitchen counter. Unlocked. Open. The screen lit up with a message from someone I didn't know. "Can't wait to see you again," it said. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I should have. The pieces didn't fit yet, but they were starting to, and the picture they painted, it wasn't one I wanted to see. But I looked anyway. The whole sordid betrayal was exposed. In the text, the photos, on her phone, it was all there. I put the phone down, walked away, because that's what you do when you don't want to know the truth. You pretend it isn't there, for a little while longer, at least. Looking back, I realized that I should have paid more attention to those silent exchanges, those small tells that hinted at something brewing just beneath the surface. But hindsight always paints a clearer picture. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the household had settled into a strange rhythm, like a calm before the storm. My wife kept herself busy, moving from task to task, as if momentum alone could starve off whatever guilt gnawed at her. Our daughter stayed in her room. The door creaked just enough to make her presence felt. Occasionally, I caught her glimpsing at her mother, her gaze heavy with unspoken questions. Me, I busied myself with small, meaningless chores. Fixing a squeaking cabinet hinge, rearranging tools in the garage, anything to avoid sitting with unease that had crept into the corners of the day. Every so often my wife would pass by, her movements a little too precise, her smile a little too forced. It was a performance, one I wasn't sure if she was putting on for me, our daughter, or herself. But though the air was thick with something, I couldn't quite name it. None of us dared to break it, not yet. It was evening when the first crack appeared in the fragile calm we'd pieced together. Late evening shadows stretched across the living room, turning familiar furniture into vague silhouettes. I waited until the house had quieted, our daughter tucked in behind her bedroom door, my father-in-law gone for the night, before I approached my wife. She stood by the window, back to me, her shoulders tense as if bracing for a storm she knew was coming. I stepped closer, careful not to spook her. "We need to talk," I said, voice steadier than I felt. She didn't turn, but I could see her reflection in the glass. Eyes shut, mouth tight, as if trying to hold something in. "You think I don't know?" I asked, each word measured. "I'm not blind. I've seen the calls you try to hide, the way you disappear into another room to answer messages you won't show me. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping through the room like a spotlight on the stage we built from lies and silence." She swallowed, then finally turned, arms folded protectively across her chest. Her eyes met mine, but there was no flinching now. If anything, there was relief, as if bringing it into the open meant she could stop running. I never wanted it to happen. Voice brittle, half apology, half confession. "I was lonely and She broke off, searching for the right words, coming up empty. "Lonely?" I repeated, letting the bitterness in my throat show. "And what was I then? The scenery?" She winced. I knew I'd struck a chord. Good. Maybe some honesty would finally bleed out all this pretense. She started to say something else. An excuse, a plea, I couldn't tell, but instead her face crumpled. Tears traced new lines down her cheeks. "I know I hurt you," she said, voice shaky. "I don't have an excuse that makes it right. I wish I did." The silence that followed stung worse than anything she could have said. I didn't speak, just waited, letting the weight of it settle between us. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Finally, she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Ask me anything," she said. "You deserve to know." Her voice was soft, almost defeated. I crossed my arms, mirroring her stance. "I want to know why," I said. "Not the loneliness, not the excuses. Why risk everything?" My heart hammered in my chest, waiting for an answer that might help me understand. Even if I couldn't forgive, at least I know what I was dealing with. She looked at me like someone who stumbled into the confession booth unprepared. "I lost sight of what mattered," she said, each word slow and weighed. "I got caught up in feeling wanted, seen, and I forgot." Her voice cracked. "I forgot how to talk to you when I needed something real." For a moment, neither of us breathed. We stood there, stripped bare of half-truths and polite smiles, staring at the wreckage of what once held us together. It wasn't closure, not yet. It was only a beginning. The brutal honesty we've avoided for so long finally played out in front of us. My daughter came out of her room, her arms crossed like a shield, and stood in the doorway. "Are we pretending everything's fine now?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room's stillness. My wife froze mid-motion. A dishcloth clenched in her hand. She didn't turn around. I stayed silent, waiting to see who would make the first move. "We're just trying to have a normal night," my wife said, her tone brittle. Our daughter scoffed. "Normal? That's rich. Don't lie to me. I heard everything." She didn't stay to argue, retreating to her room before either of us could respond. My wife finally turned, her eyes darting to me as if seeking backup. But I didn't have anything to give her. The quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was a battlefield between skirmishes, the kind where everyone counts their wounds and wonders how much fight they have left. The next morning, the air felt heavier than if the house had soaked up all the unspoken words from the night before. My wife stayed in the kitchen, busying herself with chores that didn't need doing, while I stood at the window nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. The sound of a door creaking open caught my attention. My daughter emerged, her face still lined with faint shadows of a restless night. She stopped short when she saw her mother. Her expression was unreadable. "I'm heading out," she said. Her eyes didn't meet mine. "Where to?" I asked. Though I wasn't sure, I wanted the answer. "Nowhere important," she replied, already halfway to the door. Her tone suggested that any follow-up questions would be unwelcome. As the door clicked shut behind her, my wife's hands paused over the sink, a dish slipping from her grip. She didn't turn to face me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "She'll come around," I offered, though the words felt hollow, even as I said them. My wife didn't reply, and for a long time, the only sound was that faint hum of the refrigerator. The house felt emptier than it should have, the weight of her absence lingering like a storm cloud. Whatever bridge had once connected us as a family was still smoldering, its planks charred. The day dragged on, weighed down by the silences that said more than words ever could. My wife stayed out of my path, retreating to the bedroom while I parked myself in the den. The television murmured in the background, but I couldn't tell you what was on. It was noise, white, static, meaningless. Late afternoon brought a knock at the door. My father-in-law stood there, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. We sat, him in the outchair, me on the couch, both of us staring at the coffee table like it held the answers to the problems we didn't want to name. She told me everything, his voice measured but carrying the weight of disappointment. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "She's my daughter, but I won't defend her mistakes," he continued. "What she did, what's been done, it's broken. But broken things can be fixed if you're willing to put in the work." His words hung in the air, the weight of their truth pressing down on me. I wanted to believe him, but the crack in my trust felt too wide, too deep. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, my voice low, almost inaudible. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then you owe it to yourself to figure out what you need, what you both need, but don't let silence be the answer. It'll eat you alive." He didn't stay much longer, leaving me alone with his words and the growing realization that forgiveness wasn't a door someone else could open for me. That evening, I heard footsteps thudding down the hall. Quick, sharp, full purpose. My daughter barged into the den, her face a storm of anger and confusion. "You were just sitting here? Really?" she snapped, her words cutting through the room like a whip. I glanced at her, caught off guard by the venom in her tone. She had her mother's fire, but right now it was aimed squarely at me. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't know. Something. Anything. You're acting like this doesn't even matter." Her words stung, mostly because they weren't entirely wrong. I had been hiding in the quiet, avoiding the mess in the other room. But hearing it laid out so plainly, so harshly, from my own child, that was a new kind of hurt. "This isn't something you can fix overnight," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "And it's not something you need to fix at all. This is between your mother and me." She crossed her arms, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. "That's not good enough. She hurt you. She hurt all of us. Don't you care?" "Of course I care," I snapped, sharper than I meant to. "But yelling about it isn't going to change what happened." She flinched, but she didn't back down. "So what? You're just going to sit here and let it fall apart?" I didn't have an answer, not a good one anyway. She stormed out before I could come up with something to say, leaving me all alone in the den with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of her bedroom door slamming shut. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing, or what I should do. Watching her anger only added to the weight of my indecision. Later that night, I finally gathered the nerve to seek her out. My wife was in the hallway, leaning against the wall, as if it was the only thing that held her up. The light overhead buzzed softly, casting shadows that stretched between us. I cleared my throat, and she looked up, eyes reddened from regrets she hadn't voiced yet. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence pressed in, thick and unfolding. "We can't keep avoiding it," I said, my voice low. We have to talk. She nodded, barely, and followed me into the living room. We stood there like strangers forced to negotiate some uneasy truce. The words that followed were halting, cautious. Neither of us offered excuses, just fragments of truth, half apologies, and uncertain hopes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small crack in the wall we built between us. Outside, the night pressed closer, indifferent to our struggles, but we were facing them head on, even if we weren't sure where it would lead. Morning came with a dull light that seeped through the kitchen window, illuminating every imperfection on the countertop and the fine layer of dust along the floorboards. I stood with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. Across the room, my wife hovered near the sink, not washing anything, just holding the edge like a lifeline. The tension in her shoulders told me she'd slept about as well as I had, which was to say, barely at all. Our daughter appeared in the doorway, half in the hall, half in the room, as if unsure whether to join us or turn on her heels and vanish. She didn't speak, but her eyes said plenty. Why this? Why now? Why had we let things get so far off track? We tried talking, that's what you call our halting exchanges. I admit I've been on autopilot for too long, drifting through routines and missing signs I should have caught. My wife offered stammered explanations, nothing to justify the hurt, but at least an admission that something had rotted beneath the surface of our marriage while I looked the other way. Our daughter crossed her arms, leaning against the frame as if bracing herself for the truth to sting. She didn't hide her disappointment. You could see it in the tight set of her jaw, the way her gaze flicked from me to her mother like she was scoring us on honesty and coming up short. No resolutions were found. No grand forgiveness. No sudden bursts of insight that untangled the knots we tied. Instead, we faced a day where every breath felt heavier than it should. Every word loaded with meaning we weren't ready to unpack. But we were finally standing in the wreckage together, acknowledging the damage instead of tiptoeing around it. A few clumsy words and forced confessions wasn't much, but they were something. A shaky step onto solid ground after weeks of stumbling through a minefield of secrets and half-truths. Outside, a bird called once, twice, then fell silent. Inside, we hovered in that uneasy quiet, aware that the real work hadn't even begun. By midday, a hush blanketed the rooms, broken only by quiet footsteps and the sound of someone clearing the throat now and then. My wife stood near the window, one hand on the sill, as though the old wood could steady her nerves. Outside, late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard, reminding me how much time had slipped away since this all began. Our daughter paced the hallway, each footstep measured, her gaze sharp and searching. She sized us up like a jury considering evidence, her eyes lingering on her mother's rigid spine and my uncertain stance. We talked, yes, but only enough to acknowledge the shape of the wound, not nearly enough to dress it. Then my father-in-law arrived, letting himself in like it was still his house. He settled into the armchair by the fireplace, resting his elbows on the arms as if he were a judge preparing to hear testimony. "Did you speak your minds?" he asked, a voice quiet but firm. He looked at me, then his daughter, then at the doorway where his granddaughter hovered, uncertain whether to enter. I nodded. Some managed. "Keep at it," he said, like a doctor reminding a patient to finish the medicine. "Don't let it fester." The four of us hovered there, not sure who should go first. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't crushing either. It held the promise that maybe, if we kept trying, we could chip away at whatever was wrapped between us. My wife shifted from foot to foot. Our daughter leaned against the doorframe, and I braced myself against the back of the couch. There were no quick fixes in that moment, just a fragile willingness to say what needed saying and hear what hurt to hear. It felt like standing at the edge of a deep water, deciding whether to wade in or churn. Outside, a breeze rustled the trees, scattering a few dry leaves against the glass. Inside, we weighed our words carefully, hoping they might lead us out of the dark and toward some semblance of understanding. Late afternoon light angled through the living room window, tinting the air with a golden hue that made the dust motes visible, drifting lazily between us. The place felt different now, no longer just a house of ghosts and secrets, but something in transition, like the moment before a storm breaks or just after it passes. I stood near the coffee table, fingertips tracing the grain of the wood, as if mapping out a route to someplace safe. My wife had settled by the sofa's arm, her posture still tight, knuckles pale from gripping the fabric, but her eyes met mine this time, holding steady instead of darting away. Our daughter hovered near the threshold, arms folded, weight shifting from one foot to the other. She looked torn. Part of her wanted to flee. The other part wanted to stay and see if we could actually mend what we had broken. My father-in-law sat quietly in the old armchair, the one with a worn patch on the right arm where countless elbows had rested. He observed without pushing, letting the silence stretch until I cleared my throat. "We can't just pretend the scars will heal on their own," I said. I let the statement hang in the air, waiting to see if anyone would pick it up. Outside, a bird called once, then fell silent, as if giving us space to respond. My wife nodded, a small, tentative tilt of her head, and released her grip on the sofa. Her gaze flicked to our daughter, a silent plea for patience. "I know," she said quietly, "but what do we do next?" Her uncertainty was almost a relief. At least it was honest. Our daughter pressed her lips together, eyes narrowing, like she was still trying to read the fine print of our intentions. She didn't say anything, but she inched a fraction closer, as if drawn toward any scrap of sincerity. My father-in-law leaned forward, the old armchair creaking beneath him. He didn't need to speak. The way he watched us was reminder enough that we owed each other action, not just words. The floorboards under my feet felt solid, but creaked faintly whenever I shifted, as if to warn me that nothing was guaranteed. I let the silence breathe before I answered. "We start by talking," I said. "Really talking, not just around it. Maybe we even consider help, someone who can guide us through this mess." The suggestion settled into the room, and I could see our daughter's jaw relax a notch. My wife's shoulders eased just slightly. Outside, the fading light cast long shadows across the floor, shapes stretching and bending as if acknowledging that we were inching, however slowly, toward a different understanding. It wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. And at that moment, a direction felt like progress. Night came on slowly, the last of light slipping beneath the horizon as if it too were wary of our fragile calm. A lamp in the corner cast a soft glow and the room felt smaller, quieter than before. My wife stood near the sofa, hands pressed together as if in prayer. Our daughter hovered close to the doorway, still guarded, but her eyes no longer burned with the same intensity. My father-in-law leaned back in his armchair, the old upholstery sighing under his weight, watching us as though he were a referee who might never blow the final whistle. I cleared my throat and looked around. "If we're serious about this," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we need real help. Someone who is entangled in all this, who can see things clearly." I half expected objections, but they didn't come. Instead, I saw subtle nods, hesitant but willing. My wife stepped forward, her tentative movements barely making a sound. There was a tremor in her voice as she replied, "I'm open to that, to anything that might help." She caught my daughter's eye, searching for a sign that the younger one might accept this step. Our daughter gave the smallest shrug, neither approval nor refusal, but better than flat denial. My father-in-law shifted in the armchair, the lamplight drawing shadows along the lines of his face. He said nothing, but his silence held a kind of permission, an understanding that he'd done what he came to do, push us toward something more honest. The air felt charged, but not with the old tension. This was something else, an awkward hope. We were standing on an unfinished bridge, debating if we trusted it enough to cross. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Words would catch in our throats, anger would flare again, and doubts would circle like angry birds. But we had named the problem, faced it head on. We were at least in motion. Our daughter released a long, measured breath. My wife took another cautious step closer, as if testing whether the ground might hold. I stood still, absorbing the moment, realizing we had started to shift away from the raw shock of betrayal and into the uncertain world of building something new. Outside, a distant car passed, its headlights sweeping a brief arc across the window before fading away. Inside, we remained. 3 generations gathered under one roof, no longer hiding from the truth. It wasn't a neat ending, far from it, but it was a direction. And that was enough to lean on for now. Let's hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. I'm reading them all. If you're loving this, smash the like button. It really helps. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.